I work with a pretty limited palette, and I like doing this one because it's less paint that you have to buy and it creates a lot of color harmony. Basically what that means is if you have fewer colors when you're painting, it's a lot easier for everything to mix together and look nicer. And the more stuff you add in, like if you add greens, you add like pinks, you add purples, all this stuff, the more you have to know how to mix them properly for everything to look well together. But if you just stick with a couple colors, then usually the end result will come out a little bit more harmonious. So I really just use a really dark blue. It's actually called Payne's Gray, but it actually comes out as a blue. I use this mostly for my skies. I find that it creates a really nice kind of muted, kind of a gray, blue, almost like a gunmetal color, and it works really, really great for my skies. So all the skies that I do, all with Payne's Gray. And then I'll use black, I'll use Mars Black, and you don't want to use black as just a color all by itself. You want to use it as a modifier. So if there's a dark shadow, I don't want to just put straight black paint down and put that on there. You're going to want to use that to modify a red or a blue or a white into a gray. That way you're going to have a little bit more like detail and information going on. White is definitely the one that you have the most of. So typically I buy big tubes of white because this is the color that you use the most whenever you're painting. So everything really tends to kind of gray down a little bit more when you use white. I generally don't use colors straight out of the tube. Like if there's something that's red or yellow, I'm not using yellow right out of the tube and putting that on there. I find that it's a little bit more pleasing when you gray it down with white. And think of it as like a Monet painting or something like that, the Impressionists. They're all very kind of like pastel looking, very light colors. And that's what I've always liked, so I guess I just kind of naturally like to paint that way as well. For my yellow, I use yellow ochre, so it's not a bright yellow, it's a very dull, muted yellow. This works really, really good for landscapes. So I use a lot of earth tones since I'm doing landscapes, and it just makes it a lot easier to make those natural colors instead of using like a bright cadmium yellow. When you mix yellow, surprisingly, with black, it makes a really, really nice green. So pretty much all of the greens over here are just yellow ochre and black. And it just makes a really, really, really nice color that way. And then for my reds, I'll use a burnt sienna, which is again another earth tone. It's basically just iron oxide, so it's rust basically. And so by using these earth colors, you can get a lot of really nice earthy tones in your paintings as opposed to like a bright green. I mix all my greens. I don't have any greens that I use here. I only use primaries. I don't have any green. I don't have any purple. I don't have any orange. For me, I just found that it was like easier to be able to mix them and figure out what colors I want. I can add a little bit here, add a little bit there. And then every now and then I'll have like a bright red, or sometimes I'll throw in a bright yellow. It depends on what I'm doing. Most of these are just the three colors that I use: the yellow ochre, burnt sienna, the Payne's Gray for the blue, and then white and black. But you know, if I'm going to be doing something, I did a commission recently where they wanted very fall foliage colors. It's hard to really get those bright pops of color when you're just using these earth tones. So I would toss in some brighter reds, some brighter yellows to be able to get those. So it's one of those things like this is my core palette, and then you toss in different colors depending on what you're trying to do. If you need something that's going to be a little bit more brighter, you add it in as needed, but you're not like dependent on it. So that's kind of how, you know, I organize my palette. I like working with a wood palette. I do have a glass palette. That's really nice. They're really easy to clean up, but I found that I really like the way that these kind of evolve over time. So you can kind of see what it used to look like. just kind of like unfinished wood, but then over time it develops this really nice patina on it, and it gets as smooth as glass. It has like a nice shine to it. And this is really nice too because when you're traveling, it's lightweight. I can put it, it actually came with the travel easel, the French box easel that I use. So it's lightweight and it looks really cool, and over time, it really kind of changes, and it kind of like shows that it's something that's been used. So with the paintings that I do, I'll typically start out and just do like really, really, really big shapes. Anytime you hear anybody talk about painting, they're always going to be talking about the big shapes and the values. And what that means is you want to kind of break things down into its most basic elements. So, you've got your sky, you've got like a building over here, maybe you have some smaller buildings, and, you've got some things that are lighter, you've got things that are darker. So those are your values, your lights and your darks. You don't really want to get bogged down into the details. You really just want to make it as basic as possible, and then from there, depending on your style, you can work into the details a little bit more. So what I'll show you guys is I'll just do a little bit of palette knife work on the sky here. So this is just oil paint straight out of the tube, and what I like to use is a medium. And what mediums do is they enable you to work with the paint in different ways. There are some mediums that dry very quickly. This one dries a little bit more quickly, and it's a little bit more of a gel consistency, so you can get some like thick impasto effects. There are some mediums that dry much more slowly. There are some people that like their paintings to stay wet for days, weeks, so that they can go back into them and move things around and change things. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the palette knife. I'm going to pick up some color here. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to get a little bit of white. I'm going to get a little bit of my medium. So the medium thins the paint down. It's really stiff to begin with. It's almost like, I don't know, like putty or something like that. It's not very easy to mix around. You can do it with a palette knife. I like using this medium just because it'll dry a little bit more quickly. But with a brush, I would not be able to just use this straight. I would need some sort of medium, usually an oil or some sort of, other solvent-based medium that will thin it down a little bit more and make it much more easier to work with. And as I said before, it changes the drying properties of it. So I'm just going to use a little bit of white, a little bit of my Payne's gray, and then, really just kind of go up here and you're just going to kind of work with it. So not really sure like what I'm going for right now. It's all about just putting some things down, and maybe I'll put a little bit of black in here, kind of gray it up a little bit. Typically, whenever you're doing a sky, you want to start darker at the top and work your way down to something that's a little bit lighter once you hit the horizon. And that's just the way that, the curvature of the earth, when you're looking up. When you're looking at the horizon, you're actually looking at more atmosphere because it's further away than what's above you. So you're seeing more particles, and it's called atmospheric perspective. So when you get down lower on the horizon, it's going to be a lot lighter. That's why when you look at mountains in the distance, they're usually kind of a light purple, a light blue. Everything in the distance is going to be a lot lighter. So when you're painting, you're going to want to use a lot of white in your paint for things that are in the distance. And as they get closer, you're going to want to use things that are a lot more darker. And that creates that sense of space in the painting. A lot of white for the distance, and things a lot darker and sharper as they get closer to you. So the one thing about the palette knife is you need a lot of paint. It really does take a lot of paint to be able to cover an area. So it can be a little bit more expensive to create because you're using a ton of paint. But what I've found is that people actually really like the palette knife paintings. They really like the thick texture, the impasto, the way that the colors work together. I really like the way that you can kind of layer. Anybody that's seen Bob Ross will kind of know how this works. If you've ever seen Bob Ross make a mountain, he would always just kind of like slowly like just drag the paint over, and then it just creates all these like breaks in the paint. And it's a way to create a lot of detail without going in and actually creating that detail by hand. So that may not be coming up that much on the camera. I'll do it with some lighter paint here. But it's a really great way to create a lot of texture without having to go in there and do it with the brush, using a very fine brush to create a lot of detail. You can just kind of like drag it a little bit, and the texture of the canvas with the texture of the paint, you know, it just will create all these nice little textures. And then you can just kind of build this up over and over and over again. So, you know, I might completely cover this in. It's going to be darker up here, lighter down here. That might dry a little bit, and then you can then go over it if you want to. Palette knife is really great for clouds. You can just layer skies, you know, almost infinitely. And it's just, it's a lot of fun, but it's really, really hard because, you know, especially if you have like a big palette knife like this, it's really hard to do detail work. So just like with paintbrushes, you have to have larger palette knives, smaller palette knives. But even then, when you have a smaller palette knife, you know, it's very hard to try and work out those details. So palette knife painters generally are a little bit more, you know, expressive in nature, and it's just the way that they turn out. So get some of the darker paint up here. And one of the things that I like a lot about painting is just the tactile nature of it. So, you know, for me, I always liked painting because it was just, you know, meditative, and it's just an enjoyable process. But there's something about just like scraping it across like the smooth palette that's just, that in itself is enjoyable. And since I've been doing this, you know, every day for a while now, you know, it's almost like something that I can't really do without anymore. It's almost become, you know, a part of my day that I have to have. And then it's not even just for the result of like, oh, I'm going to have a painting completed today that I'm going to be able to put on Etsy and sell it. It's for just this process. You know, it's like buttering. It's like putting peanut butter on toast, really. You know, the consistency of the paint is like peanut butter, and then you get the scratchiness from the canvas, and then you put everything up there, and then, so just that tactile sensation itself is really enjoyable. So I would say, if anything else, that people should maybe try painting just for the process. Don't worry so much initially about your outcome. I mean, obviously you want to have goals, whether that is to like paint realism or something abstract. You know, just be comfortable with doing the process itself and not to worry too much about what you're creating initially. That's going to come with time, like anything else. But just enjoy it. Just enjoy the way that the paint smells. There's a big misconception, I think, with oil paint that it's harmful and it's difficult to work with. The oil paint itself is just a pigment. So, you know, again, earth tones, like this is like rust, clay, this is just carbon, and then it's linseed oil. So, like, in theory, you could probably eat it and you would be fine. I don't recommend this, but it's not hazardous. It's not poisonous. It's all of the solvents that you use that can be hazardous to some people. So the turpentine gives some people headaches. There's odorless mineral spirits that you can use. So that's really where people, I think, became afraid a little bit of oil painting because of some of the solvents that had to be used. But nowadays you don't even really have to use the solvents to be able to paint. I can do an entire painting and clean my brushes with just the oil paint and oil alone. So a lot of people don't know that you can actually clean your brushes with oil. So you can't clean the brushes in water. You can actually clean them with soap and water, and I do that as well. So you don't even need a turpentine or a harsh solvent to clean your brushes, to clean up your palette. You can use walnut oil, you can use safflower oil, and it actually cleans your brushes really, really well. And now I've gotten to the point where I don't even really fully clean my brushes after each session. Since I'm painting every day, I usually have a couple brushes that I use. I'll have some brushes for my whites, I'll have some brushes for my darks, some brushes for my midtones, and then I will then just clean them a little bit in oil, and then I'll dip them in safflower oil, and that keeps them fresh. It keeps them from drying out, and I don't have to use any solvents. I might use a solvent to clean my brushes if I'm not going to be using my brushes for a while. So if I do live painting and I'm using some of my larger brushes, then I might go ahead and just clean those since I'm not going to be using them for a while, and then put those away. But if I'm going to be using them daily, I don't use any solvents to clean them. It's just, the paint and some natural oil, and that's pretty much it. So you can paint solvent free. You can paint completely free of any chemicals. It's just all natural earth pigments. Now you do want to be careful. There are some paints that you can use. So there's lead whites, there's cadmium colors, there's like a cadmium red, cadmium yellow. Those are heavy metals, and so while you don't have to paint with those, if you choose to paint with them, you just have to be careful. Some people choose to wear gloves, or just make sure when you're done, wash your hands really well so that you're not picking up a piece of pizza and then eating that with the lead paint on your hands. So you just have to be smart about it if you do choose to use some of those heavy metal paints. But I don't use any of those here, and I can still create a really good painting.